Quickly for being here.
Estamos presentes.
Estamos presentes, Melanie. So we're very grateful to the James Connolly Forum for bringing Steve tonight to be with us. My name is Pepe Rossi. I'm with Albany, Cuba Solidarity, a local capital region group that's been working to help bring an end to the shameful blockade or embargo on Cuba that takes away our right as American citizens or even residents of this country to travel freely to Cuba. And in essence, to bring, to assert Cuba's right to self-determination and to and for them to choose their destiny. It is very appropriate that we speak about Cuba and Venezuela in the same phrase. Many of us are aware of the solidarity of Cuba and Venezuela in recent years. That since the beginning of the Bolivarian Revolution, there's been a close link between Cuba and Venezuela, a link of mutual support that is manifested in tens of thousands of medical workers from Cuba that have traveled and provided services to Venezuela, in tens of thousands of Venezuelans that have recovered their sight thanks to surgical interventions by Cuban physicians. And Venezuela really came to the support of Cuba in perhaps the most critical period of the Cuban Revolution following the fall of the Soviet Union. And it really, for those of us that are familiar with the difficulties of Cuba during the so-called special period, we do understand, we do know that it was the government of Hugo Chavez and his support for Cuba that really marks the end of the special period in Cuba. So many of us know that story. I wonder how many of us know that back at the turn of the previous century, I'm not talking about the 20th, I'm talking about the beginning now of the 19th century, that Cuban and Puerto Rican and Venezuelan abolitionists and independence leaders were conspiring together against Spain. That the support for each other goes back to the very foundation of these nations. And after all, that is what the Bolivarian Revolution represents. Bolivar, after all, called the great liberator for good reason, because he brought an end to the Spanish colonial empire in this hemisphere. And back in 1819 already, just shortly after the victories of the Venezuelan, back then, the Gran Colombia army over the Spaniards, back then, from the very beginning, back then Gran Colombia, later Venezuela, would be demanding the end of colonialism in Cuba and Puerto Rico. In 1825, there was a Congress in Panama, and Simón Bolívar and other leaders pushed for the end of Spanish colonialism by sponsoring an army that would finally liberate the last colonies of Spain in this hemisphere, namely Cuba and Puerto Rico. A movement that was opposed, guess what, by the United States. So that this solidarity, these links between the Cuban Revolution and the Bolivarian Revolution have its beginnings in the very first days of both republics. So we're very pleased that we have Steve Ellner. We're very pleased that The James Connolly Forum has brought us again another wonderful speaker. And James Connolly Forum does that again and again. Don't they?
Yes. Bravo.
Yeah. For those of us that may not be familiar with James Connolly, he came to the United States in 1902 and moved to Troy in 1903. He set up a house not far from here at 96 Ingles Avenue, a few blocks from here, where this forum takes place. He worked for the Metropolitan Insurance Company until a recession caused the firm to falter. While here, he was active in the Socialist Labor Party, where he engaged in a notable dispute with its leader, Daniel de Leon, or de Leon, you might say, over the utility of fighting for wage increases. He was for this, and other questions. As most of you know, when he returned to Ireland, he played a leading role in great labor conflicts like the Dublin lockout of 1913, and led the Irish Citizen Army in its uprising against British rule in 1916. He was executed by the British as a result. Today, he is recognized as one of the great socialist leaders of the 20th century and an adoptive son of Troy. Before I move on to introduce our speaker, I'd like to know about some announcements. There are a great group of wonderful activists here from many different causes. Any announcements, please? Yes, John.
Well, the next James Connolly Forum is going to be only in a few weeks with Bhaskar Sankara, who is the editor of Jacobin Magazine, a very exciting new venture in socialist publishing, and I'm sure a lot of you will be interested in attending that. So that's on June 19th. It's going to be a Friday night, 7 p.m.
Thank you. Other announcements? Salud. Well, Albany, Cuba has an announcement. Our next major event, we're going to welcome the Pastors for Peace caravan. Is going to again be making a stop in Albany. And we're very proud of the fact that the capital region has consistently, over the past 20-some years, been one of the leading contributors for the Peace Caravan. We owe a great debt to Mabel Leon, who has been herself has been the caravan in the capital region for many years, and she has done wonderful work, making the capital region. The capital region, we're proud of this, has donated consistently over the years more medical supplies, more funds than Boston, than New York City, than many other major cities. And so we're very proud of this, and we're looking forward to another wonderful welcoming party for the caravan. This year is going to be on a Tuesday, June 30th. Please mark your calendars. June 30th will be at 5:30. We'll be at the First Presbyterian Church in Albany. That's at 362 State Street. We'll have a potluck dinner. We'll have some speakers. It'll be another wonderful event. We'll probably have a silent auction and some other events. If you would like to help us by donating, by making a humanitarian donation, we're accepting medicines. We got some wonderful, this year we got someone to donate a lot of equipment for persons with disabilities. And we're going to fill at least one busload from here. We're proud of that. So we hope that you'll join us. Again, it's going to be on Tuesday, June 30th at 5:30 at the First Presbyterian Church. And please speak to me at the end of this if you would like to help us out in some way. Speak with me. Any other announcements? So we're very happy, very proud to have here in Troy at the James Connolly Forum, Steve Ellner with us. I learned about Steve, I read a few years ago a wonderful article of his in NACLA, the North American Congress in Latin America. That's how I came to know about Steve and his work on Venezuela. But his work on Venezuela goes much further back. In fact, this August will be 40 years.
Wow.
40 years since he traveled to Venezuela to work on his dissertation. His dissertation, doctoral dissertation, had to do with organized labor and political parties in Venezuela. And shortly thereafter, that was in 1975, shortly thereafter in 77, Steve began to teach economic history at Venezuela's Universidad de Oriente. And he's still there. Since then, he has published many books. And when in 1988, Hugo Chavez and his movement reached power, Steve realized that this could be a transformative movement, a transformative development in the history, not just of Venezuela as it well has, but of Latin America. And so he has since then made the study of the political movement of Chavismo or the Bolivarian Revolution has been a principal focus of Steve's work. And this is very timely for us at a time when the Obama administration and the mass media has been spreading falsehoods, misinformation about the government of Venezuela. We're particularly happy to have Steve here. They're all, Obama, only a couple of months ago, said that Venezuela was a threat to U.S. national security. Just like Grenada was a terrible threat to U.S. national security some years earlier. They've walked that back since, but the reason the Obama administration has had to walk back those statements has been because those statements were met with just clear rejection by most of the leaders of Latin America. Even conservative nations like Mexico condemned such statements from the Obama administration, and so they've tried to walk them back. Steve has published, as I said, several books on the Chavismo and the Bolivarian Revolution, including books like Rethinking Venezuelan Politics, Class Conflict, and the Chavez Phenomenon. He's also published op-eds in major publications like the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and he's published, as I said, in NACLA and in these Times and other progressive publications. His most recent book is The Latin American Radical Left, Challenges and Complexities of Political Power in the 21st Century. Steve made this trip, the trip that brings him here to Troy, in part to participate on the Left Forum just a couple of weeks ago. Before that, he was in my hometown of San Juan, Puerto Rico, participating in the annual conference of the what is it, Congreso de Latin American Latin American Studies Association. So we're very happy to have him. We're very proud to have him. Please join me in welcoming Steve Ellner to the James Connolly Forum.
Thank you, Pepe. The last book that Pepe mentioned, I'm the editor of it. I'm not the author of it. You know, the situation in Venezuela, I think, just like the politics in most countries, in most situations, and just like life in general, you have some aspects of what's happening in Venezuela that are black and white. In other aspects, the opposition, the media, the United States, the State Department exaggerates, but there are elements of truth. And others which are complex, and you can say that the statements that are being made are true to a certain extent. So just to separate these three different types of situations, the accusations of Obama when he imposed sanctions on Venezuelan government officials and called Venezuela, as Pepe mentioned, a threat to national security in the United States. That's a black and white kind of situation. There's no element of truth in that, in my opinion. And specifically, the accusations now against Venezuela for violation of human rights stems from protests that occurred last year around this time that lasted 3 or 4 months. They were known in Venezuela as the Guarimba. And as a result of that, there were jailings. Several thousand people were jailed, and in the present, there are about 40 people who are in jail. And so the U.S. government talks about violation of human rights and calls for the release of these people, and specifically the release of one of the main opposition leaders, who is Leopoldo Lopez. What they don't say is why these people were thrown in jail in the first place. One of the things that they don't say, the media doesn't say, the U.S. government doesn't say, that is relevant, although it doesn't justify this guy being thrown in jail, but what they don't say is that Leopoldo Lopez belongs to what has been traditionally one of the richest families. In fact, what you could call, the person who you could call the Rockefeller of Venezuela, Eugenio Mendoza, who was the head of the cement industry, of banks, and other sectors of the economy, who was really the richest and most prominent industrialist, the most prominent capitalist in Venezuela from the 40s up into the 80s, when he passed away. Leopoldo Lopez's mother was this guy's niece. And Leopoldo's grandfather was a business person who was closely associated with Mendoza, in other words, with his brother. So we're not talking about somebody who comes from the middle classes or non-privileged sectors of the population. We're talking about one of the person who belongs to one of the richest families historically in Venezuela in the 20th century. But that's not the real issue. The real issue is that Leopoldo Lopez inspired these 3 or 4 months of protests. And those protests, none of them, there were protests that occurred throughout Venezuela over this extended period of time, none of them, and I might be exaggerating because maybe there were 1 or 2, but I would say none of them were legal. They were all illegal. And they were illegal not because they didn't get permission to protest. They were illegal because the peaceful ones involved the blocking of traffic. And you saw that throughout all of Venezuela. Everybody, or anybody who lived in an urban area of Venezuela, ran up against this. The traffic was blocked for hours at a time because they would take over a main drag of 3 lanes or 4 lanes, and they'd occupy all the main, except one. And the one lane that was open, they'd force to slow down. So you'd have a backup of hours. And this was these were the peaceful protests. And then the violent protests involved widespread violence. The metro stations of the eastern part of Caracas, they were heavily damaged. There were something like 80 metro buses in Caracas that were heavily damaged. In fact, now you see in Caracas some of the buses that had been damaged and were recovered, they have a sign on them that says this bus was a victim of the Guarimba, some such statement. Over 150 doctors, there were reports, there were of over 150 Cuban doctors who were attacked by these protesters. The Cuban doctors live in the barrios as part of a program that goes back more than 10 years. Something equivalent of oil for medical aid. Cubans are involved in a number of activities in Venezuela, but the most important one by far is the presence of Cuban doctors. And they were attacked. They're a symbol of, socialism, communism. The opposition is constantly bad-mouthing the Cubans from the very beginning. And so these more than 150 doctors were attacked by the demonstrators. Public property was damaged. And things that I saw in my neck of the woods, I don't live in Caracas, but this violence took place throughout Venezuela. Where I live, what I did see was fires in the street, barricades, and the like. I won't go into more detail. But what I will say is that Leopoldo Lopez promoted this. He inspired it. His slogan was, in Spanish, salida ya. Salida means, in this context, regime change. Now, and ya is now. Regime change now. And they dropped the ya. But it was regime change, salida. And he stated publicly that when he was asked, how long is this going to go on for, he said, well, until the Maduro regime falls. You can imagine, if this took place in the United States, these people, at least the violent demonstrators, would be called terrorists. And the accusation of violation of human rights, no mention is made of the fact that, okay, some of the demonstrators were peaceful. They were illegal. They were they involved civil disobedience, but they were peaceful. And others were not peaceful. Everybody knows that. There's no secret in Venezuela. So that the opposition, when they talk about violation of human rights and they talk about these people who are in jail, they don't distinguish. Their slogan is the release of those people. There are now 40, approximately, people who are in jail. Some of them are police who the government arrested because they were accused of some incidences that took place. But most of them are the protesters. No distinction is made between the violent protests and the nonviolent protests. And that's exactly what the media did. They conflated violent protests and nonviolent, so that the image that people had in the United States was that, these peaceful protests and government repression. 6 National Guardsmen were killed. Several policemen, 1 or 2 policemen were killed also. Here in the United States, I see it on TV, and everybody knows that a policeman is killed, and they talk about cop killers. That's, practically a household word here in the States. And anybody who's responsible for that naturally faces a death penalty. But in addition to that, that's really serious business here in the United States. Well, several cops, or at least 1 cop, and 6 National Guardsmen were killed by these protesters. So that when I say that the issue of violation of human rights doesn't have any subtleties to it, that it's a black and white issue, I'm referring to this. And I'm referring to the position of the U.S. government of supporting the opposition, supporting slogans of the opposition, demanding the release of these prisoners who are called political prisoners, without any distinction made between whether they were peaceful protests. Because if you're talking about non-peaceful protests, violent protesters, I don't think that you can call them political prisoners. It depends on how you define the word. But in any case, the U.S. government, the media, the international media, much of the media in Venezuela, highlighted the actions of the police, not so much the police, the National Guard, when really similar actions that take place in the United States, actions in New York City, in Baltimore recently, hundreds were thrown in jail as a result of violent activity. And nobody in the United States, to talk about Sid Resnick, Art, I see Art over there, he knew Sid Resnick very well. He was a U.S. a leftist in New Haven, a communist, continued to be involved in leftist activity. I consider him my mentor. And I remember at Yale University back in the 1980s, there was a protest, anti-apartheid protest, and there was civil disobedience, and he participated in the civil disobedience. Now, nobody in the United States objects to the people who engage in civil disobedience being thrown in jail. That's a given. Those are the rules of the game. Now, if the sentence is extensive, or if there's a very huge fine, that's another story. But you expect to be thrown in jail if you commit acts of civil disobedience. In Venezuela, the opposition claimed that that was their right, that was their constitutional right to participate in these nonviolent protests. So that, again, this is a black and white issue. But the economic problems that Venezuela is facing is not a black and white issue. It involves a number of factors. Among them, policies that I would criticize, but also a number of other factors, including the opposition and the business sector as well. But just to start with, the price of oil has declined, as you know, and Venezuela has always, since the 1920s, been very dependent on oil. In fact, oil-producing countries tend to be more dependent on oil than commodity producers, single commodity producers in other third world countries. In other words, countries that produce copper, tin, that kind of thing, they're dependent on those products, but not to the extent that oil-producing countries that belong to OPEC are dependent on oil, on petroleum. And so when the price of oil declines, there's always a situation of disorders, economic and political disorder. In the 1980s, that happened after the price of oil skyrocketed. In the 1970s, it declined in the 1980s, and that led into a series of disturbances in February of 1989 that in turn led into the coup that Chavez led in 1992. So this is standard for Venezuela and for any country that's so dependent on a single commodity. So that's one factor. But the problem of scarcity, the problem of long lines of people waiting to buy basic commodities, the problem of smuggling, contraband to neighboring Colombia, the problem of price speculation and inflation that produces, and the problem of hoarding, which is a big problem. And that is a result, in part, of a policy that is controversial, which is the regulation, and it's something that is really hard for people who live in the United States who don't have a lot of experience either studying or traveling to Latin America. That is price controls. We in the States really don't know what that system is all about, but it means that as of going back prior to Chavez's election in 1998, actually going back to 1983, Venezuela established a system in which you have preferential dollars, a system of preferential dollars, which means that if somebody wants dollars to put in a U.S. bank account, they have to pay a certain price. But if they want dollars to import goods, let's say basic commodities, the government sells them dollars at a much cheaper rate. So that's to really favor the popular sectors of the population. It's to favor national development because with the preferential dollars you import machines. So that is, a rational system. In 1983, it was established because there was a run on the bolivar, which is the Venezuelan currency. And if the government really didn't have any choice, if the government had waited a few weeks more, it would have been left without reserves at all, without dollars at all. So it had to do this. And that was in effect off and on, mainly on, up until the 1990s, the late when Chavez became president. And in 2002, 2003, for 2 months, there was a strike that was led by the business organization, the Chamber of Commerce of Venezuela, known as Fedicommerce. And that strike was designed to overthrow the government. That was their stated aim. So when the strike was defeated, there was a possibility of rampant inflation, because according to the law of supply and demand, if you withdraw supply, if you're not producing anything, the business people were not producing anything for political reasons to overthrow Chavez. So if you're not producing anything, naturally the prices are going to go up. The demand is the same, but fewer products. So Chavez established the system of exchange controls, or reestablished the system, under different parameters. But it was a system that really had been in effect going back off and on to 1983. And that system worked because the difference between the official exchange rate and the unofficial exchange rate was 2 to 1. In other words, what you had to pay in order to get dollars, in order to deposit in your bank account in the United States, was just double what the importers had to pay in order to get dollars to import commodities. That was a manageable situation. Now, Chavez had cancer, and he fought cancer for several years, but towards the end of 2012, well, he died in March of 2013, so we know that by the end of 2012, he must have been under tremendous physical and psychological pain. And it was at that point, and perhaps on account of that, I don't have any evidence to that effect, and I'm not asserting this as a fact, but perhaps it was the case, that it was at that point that the price of the dollar was manipulated, and it shot way up. Chavez was not in a position to react to that situation. And so instead of having this ratio between the official and unofficial rate being 2 to 1, it became 3, 4, 5, 6 to 1, and now it's much more than that. And once that disparity between the official and unofficial rate got so much out of hand, any attempt to reestablish this ratio of 2 to 1 would generate inflation. Because if you increase the price of the dollar, and everything that's being imported, 70–80% of what is produced is imported in Venezuela. So if the importers have to pay much more for the dollar in order to pay for the imports, well, they're going to jack up prices. So President Maduro, who took over from Chavez in March of 2013, inherited this situation. So, the opposition, when they talk about this unwieldy situation, when they talk about the fact that you have a dollar, an unofficial dollar that's so high, and an official dollar, such a big difference between the two, and they say, well, the government's incompetent. But keep in mind that this situation presented itself in a very special set of circumstances, when the president of the country was dying. Okay? So that's one thing to keep in mind. Another aspect of this problem that we have with scarcity, long lines, hoarding, contraband. Why the contraband? Because with this difference between the official and unofficial rate, which translates itself into a big difference between the regulated price of product. In Venezuela, I think much of Latin America, but Venezuela, which is the case that I know, basic commodities have been regulated. The price has been regulated over an extended period of time, going back to the 70s at least. So you've always had that. But now you have a situation in which there's also a big disparity between the regulated price of basic commodities, from diapers to milk to sugar to rice to shaving cream, which was a big problem for me for a while, but I finally was able to buy shaving cream. The difference between the regulated price, if you could get these products, then you paid very little. But if you couldn't, then you had to buy them on the black market. And the black market price was not 50% more, 60% more, it's a lot greater. So that's the problem. Now, like I said before, part of the problem is that the government has not succeeded in narrowing this disparity between the official rate of the dollar and the unofficial rate of the dollar. So that's perhaps partly the responsibility of the government. But as I said before, the problem presented itself when Chavez was very ill. But another part of the problem, and this is why I say the situation is complex, is that there is what President Maduro calls an economic war going on. This is also controversial. The opposition denies this is an economic war. But the government has, for instance, occupied different warehouses, stores, etc. Factories, although maybe not as many, but they demonstrate that some of these products have been sitting around for long periods of time. A couple months ago, for instance, they occupied 8 warehouses of Herrera Hermanos. Herrera Hermanos had goods sitting around for a couple months. Goods that are sold like, as they say in Spanish, pan caliente. No store would have any difficulty selling all of the items, no matter how much they had, in a matter of hours. Milk, a number of items that are in short supply. So why are these goods sitting around for months? They're sitting around for months, I believe, and this is called hoarding. But why the hoarding? I mean, what do they benefit? Well, probably, or I would imagine, that the idea was to sell these products to Colombia through, illegal networks. But they couldn't do that overnight because they have to set the thing up. They have to hire, truck drivers. They have to get the trucks. They have to bribe people along the way. So it's not an easy proposition. So that makes sense. I mean, that's a possible explanation, that the destiny of these goods was neighboring Colombia, and this is completely illegal in Venezuela. It's hard to believe that they had in mind selling these products in stores when they were dated several months before. So this is an example. And one of the owners, or one of the partners of Herrera Hermanos is a woman who is an important member of Voluntad Popular. Voluntad Popular is the party of this guy who's in jail, Leopoldo Lopez. So there is evidence that, part of the problem is the economic war. It's not too hard to imagine that the private sector is engaged in this economic war, because this is what they did in 2002. 2002, they created shortages, and that was a terrible situation, those 2 months. There were shortages of everything. They created shortages in order to overthrow the government, and they didn't make any beans about that. This was their objective. It was supported by the labor leadership, the traditional laborship, but it wasn't a strike. Because a strike is, and I mean, they called it a strike, but a strike is when you tell the workers, there's a strike, don't go to work. But you close the doors, you close the factory gate, and the workers, whether they show up or not, aren't able to work. So it wasn't a strike. It was a lockout. In Spanish, the word for strike is also lockout, paro, patronal. So they call it a paro. But it was, of the different leaders, there were 3 main leaders. The main leader was the head of the business organization, the Chamber of Commerce, Fedicommerce. And the president of Fedicommerce, the previous president of Fedicommerce, before this guy led the general strike, or the lockout, the previous president of Fedicommerce was the one that spearheaded the coup that overthrew Chavez for 2 days and became president. So here the Chamber of Commerce is trying to overthrow the Chavez government twice in less than 1 year, in the course of 1 year. So it's not hard to believe that Fedicommerce is contributing in a big way to these economic problems. And I believe that Maduro has not done everything possible to confront the situation. He's been successful in some ways. During the Guarimba, I think he was very effective, because he called for a peace dialogue. The opposition, I mean, during these 3-4 months of violence, of all these protests, of civil disobedience, he called on the opposition parties, the opposition political leaders, to sit down and talk. And they refused to. Then they accepted negotiations. They lasted just a week or two, and then really for no reason at all, for no legitimate reason at all, they dropped out. So the opposition was opposed to the dialogue, and Maduro said, you know, we want to sit down and talk. Maduro did succeed in convincing the business organization to participate in this dialogue, the dialogue for peace, or of peace. So he was effective. But I believe that in order to face the opposition, in order to deal with such an aggressive opposition, an opposition that has tried to overthrow the government on a number of occasions, an opposition that even when it's not trying to overthrow the government, does not recognize the government's legitimacy, which has been a constant throughout these 16 years, or at least since the coup in 2002. The opposition is what political scientists call a disloyal opposition, an opposition that does not recognize the government's legitimacy. In this case, claims that the government is trying to establish a dictatorship and criticizes practically everything the government says and does. So in the face of this disloyal opposition, the government has to take advantage of situations in which the government has emerged victorious in a specific conflict. After the coup, after the general strike, after they win an election, that's the moment to deepen the process of change and to carry out policies that are unpopular. For instance, right now, the necessity of narrowing the gap between the official rate of the dollar and the unofficial rate of the dollar, that would be very unpopular. That means devaluation. It means people are going to have less purchasing power. But in certain situations, the government has the upper hand. The Chavistas have the upper hand. And so that's the moment to carry out these difficult policies and to deepen the process of change, to radicalize the process, if you want to use that word. Chavez understood that well. But there were a couple of exceptions in my mind. I won't go into that. But Chavez understood that well. And each time, practically each time, he emerged victorious after he won the recall election, after he won the national presidential elections of 2006 with 63% of the vote, the highest percentage of vote of any presidential candidate in modern history since 1958, which is the modern democratic period in Venezuela. So he took advantage. He took advantage of those situations, with one or two exceptions. I will talk about that. But in the case of Maduro, Maduro is in a very difficult situation with this guarimba, with the fact that he won the elections with only, the presidential elections, he won with only 1.5 percentage point difference. But there are two instances in which he could have carried out difficult decisions. After he was elected president, the same year, getting years mixed up, yeah. In December of 2013, he was the Chavistas won the municipal elections by a difference of 11.5% of the vote. So that was, trying to get my dates straight here. Yeah, it was December of 2013. So that was an ideal moment. The opposition had been clobbered. The opposition claimed that these elections were going to be a plebiscite. A plebiscite means, you know, it's an election about President Maduro. So if the Chavistas lose, that means, even though these were municipal elections, these were elections for mayor, for city council, más nada. And the political scientists in the United States attack Chavez for being a plebiscite president. All the elections under Chavez were all about Chavez. They weren't about local issues. So Chavez got criticized for this. And this is what the opposition did. Here are local elections, and the opposition said, we're going to win these elections. And that's the first step for getting Chavez out of power. Now they're saying that today, with elections that are coming up for the National Assembly, the Congress. And the head of the opposition alliance, Jesus Torrealba, is saying the same thing. He's not using the word plebiscite, but he's saying, we win these elections, and we're going to get Chavez out of there. So this didn't happen. The Chavistas won those elections. That was a moment to carry out difficult policies, perhaps devaluate substantially, to reduce this disparity between official prices and unofficial prices. And then after the Guarimba, after the violent protests in 2014, that was another moment in which the Chavistas had the upper hand. The opposition was demoralized. They had claimed that these protests were going to lead to the overthrow of Maduro. They claimed that Maduro's days were numbered. These protests were, a lot of people, felt uncomfortable. And the protests took place in the upper class and middle class areas, not in the poor areas. The poor people didn't support the protests. They took place in municipalities in which the mayors were members of the opposition, So a lot of people had misgivings about the protests, and the opposition, people in the opposition, not major leaders, but the opposition people who were promoting the protests said, just hang on, just hang in there. We're going to overthrow Maduro in a week. They were convinced of that. When that didn't happen, the opposition was greatly demoralized. So those were two moments in which Maduro could have acted, and he didn't. And one of the things that he could have done, in addition to the devaluation that I mentioned, is there is a proposal of a left current within the Chavista movement. One of the groups is called Marea Socialista. We were talking about that. Marea Socialista. Marea Socialista is a party, PSUV, and the Communist Party of Venezuela. They propose the state takeover, the nationalization of foreign commerce, so that the preferential dollars for imports, that it's been well documented that the people who are getting these preferential dollars to pay for the imports, in a lot of cases, they're paying for bogus imports. And if you have such a big disparity between the official and unofficial rate, they, phony up the imports, or they claim that the imports are worth a lot more than they are. And it's hard for the government to keep tabs on this. A pharmaceutical company, for instance, and this has been documented by the Minister of Health, Ventura, who has documented that there's been a lot of fraud. But how can the government demonstrate that medicine or components, certain medical components, are worth such and such amount instead of such and such amount? It's difficult. But there's also corruption in the government. There's no question about that. So that the proposal is that the state take over foreign commerce. Now that would create controversy. But what I'm saying is those moments in which the Chavistas have the upper hand, that's the time to act. And Maduro hasn't done that. In addition to that, Maduro has followed a middle path with regard to cases of price speculation and hoarding and contraband. When semis are discovered with goods that are obviously going to Colombia, this is well publicized. When warehouses are taken over and they demonstrate that the products have been laying around for several months. In some cases, there are arrest orders. In some cases, executives are thrown in jail. But there's no follow-up, there's no discussion, there's no publicity about what happens to the semis. The government says that all the equipment, all the infrastructure, all the trucks that are involved in contraband will be taken over by the state. And that's great. But you don't hear of any of what really happens. There's no publicity, there's no information. And the people who are the owners of these warehouses there's no information about what happens with them. So that creates skepticism. And the reason for that, I believe, is that there is a negotiation between the government and private business. This is pragmatism. But if you consider that the private sector was involved in the coup attempt in 2002, in the general strike in 2002, 2003, Maduro at least was successful in getting the main business organization to sit down and engage in this peace dialogue that I referred to, at a time when the opposition parties refused to do that. But you don't negotiate without making concessions. That's what negotiation is all about. Art knows all about that. Collective bargaining, management gives in, organized labor gives in, and that's what collective bargaining is all about. If you're not willing to make concessions, you're not going to sit down in the first place. So I believe that one of the concessions was to accept Fede Cámara's demand that the bargaining, that these cases in which executives, in which truck drivers are arrested because of contraband, because of hoarding, because of price speculation, that the government rule out a fast track, that it goes through the courts. And since it goes through the courts, that's a time-consuming process. Okay? So that's a concession to the private sector. But it has created a certain amount of skepticism among the Chavistas themselves with regard to what's really going on. So one of the things I argue is that these concessions, this middle ground, and certain expedients, measures that you could call populist, or you could call pragmatism, occur because the enemy has a lot of resources. The enemy is not only the politicians on the right, but also the business sector that supports them, the church hierarchy, which supported the coup against Chavez. The day after the coup, they were with the head of the business organization who pronounced himself, or got pronounced, president of Venezuela. And they were there clapping and with big smiles on their face. This is the church hierarchy, the leading members of the church.
Which church?
The Catholic Church. Venezuela's, Catholic country, although there's an important non-Catholic Christian element. But these were members of the Catholic Church. The media boasted of the fact that the coup would not have taken place without them. The day after the coup, they said, this thing we would not have gotten rid of Chavez had it not been for us. So this is what, the Chavistas are up against, plus the United States. This is what the Chavistas are up against. So after the general strike, Chavez had to make a decision. And this has a lot to do with what's happening now. Fede Cámaras had tried to overthrow the government twice in less than a year. And Chavez had to decide what to do about the fact that not all business people supported the strike. There were a lot of some small business people who worked and got great compensation as a result. They made a lot of money. The government was in a tough position, and they provided. And some of the media, Frontline in the United States, had a lengthy program on Chavez. Their program, is it an hour or an hour and a half? Frontline. An hour. Well, I was on that. They paid for my trip to Caracas. They interviewed me. They said they liked everything I said. And I was quoted twice. Two innocuous statements. Like 2 and 2 is 4. On the other hand, they interviewed people in the opposition, and they interviewed one Chavista who came off as somebody who was crazy. She wasn't crazy. But she was very emotional, and she came from the popular sectors of the population, and so she comes off as somebody who doesn't know how to express herself well. And I got quoted twice, saying nothing, basically. But in any case, they claimed that these small business people who cooperated with the Chavez government, they were the hero. They defeated the strike. If it wasn't because of them, Chavez would have been overthrown. I don't agree with that at all. But they certainly played an important role. So that Chavez had to decide whether to treat the business sector the same, not provide privileges. After all, if you're socialist, well, he still wasn't a socialist yet, but you know, if you're socialist, if you're a leftist, the business class, the profit motive, they're all the same. So he had to decide whether he should just proceed as if the strike hadn't occurred, proceed as if the coup hadn't occurred, or whether it was correct to formulate a policy, to formulate a strategy towards the business sector. And he decided on the latter. And he stated that he wouldn't provide one more preferential dollar to Fedicamas, to the business sector, to the people who try to overthrow him. And so he privileged these small business people, medium-sized business people, who had demonstrated that they were willing to cooperate with the government in a situation like that. Now, obviously, some of these business people were opportunists, others were pro-Chavez. Some of them say publicly that they're pro-Chavez and they cooperate with the government, and there are actually business organizations that are pro-Chavez. And others were anti-Chavez, but they were professionals, and they said, you know, business people don't have any reason to participate in political activity, and certainly not in a coup. So it made sense for the government, after the general strike, to make that distinction between business people who are reliable, even though they were opportunistic and they made a lot of money, but they were reliable, and business people who are out to overthrow the government. But that situation led into a situation in which some of those same members of the emerging bourgeoisie made a lot of money and were involved in illegal activity, manipulation of banks, and that led into the financial crisis in Venezuela in 2009. And Chavez didn't think twice about reacting, taking over the banks. He didn't do what Obama did in 2009. He didn't do what Caldera did in Venezuela with a similar type of situation, a financial crisis in 1994, in which he provided subsidies just like Obama did. Chavez took over the banks, and he jailed the bankers. There were arrest orders for 50 or 60 of them. Most of them fled the country. That is a well-deserved applause. And you know, one of the bankers was the brother of practically his right-hand man, a trusted minister who resigned, but I mean he wasn't at fault. I mean, his brother, there wasn't any evidence that he was involved. But in any case, several of these members were thrown in jail and were in jail for 3 years. So that this is an example of pragmatism. And I think that these pragmatic and populist policies are adopted as a result of the actions of the opposition. And you know, I someday I'll write an article on this. I really think that that same situation can be applied to leftist experiences in power in general. The communist left in power, the communists in power in the 20th century, without getting into the Trotsky and Stalin thing. That, you know, these countries, in the case of the Soviet Union, the invasion of the Soviet Union shortly after the 1917 revolution, and then the threat of Nazi Germany and the German invasion, that some of the things that happened, which are unfortunate, which should be condemned, and other things that you can define as populism, and other things that you can define as pragmatism, in the case of Venezuela. I think these things have to be placed in context. And part of the context, without denying, and this analysis that I'm providing about Venezuela is not meant to say that this is path dependent. In other words, it's not meant to say, well, there are no options. And so let's not blame Stalin, let's not blame Maduro or Chavez for the mistakes that are made. What I'm saying is there are certain moments in which there are options. When the enemy is clobbered, it's demoralized, and the leftists in power can adopt policies that are controversial, and the opposition is not in a position to take advantage of that situation of discontent in order to try to overthrow the government because they're up against the wall at that particular moment. So I'm not saying that, I'm not presenting a deterministic, and I'm not exonerating Stalin for what he did, but I'm just saying that it seems to me that the Venezuelan experience demonstrates that these policies are adopted to face an enemy that has tremendous resources and demonstrates that they are not committed to democracy at all and are willing to adopt any measure, any tactic, any strategy in order to overthrow the government. I have a lot more to say. Well, look at this. Book. Yeah, 10 pages. Just to give you an example of, I talked about pragmatism when I talk about the unofficial alliance with the emerging bourgeoisie after the general strike of 2002-2003. But an example of populist measures, the relaxing of controls over the granting of credit, the granting of subsidies or financial aid to community councils, to workers' cooperatives. The collateral, which somebody who wants to form a cooperative had to put up in order to guarantee that the loan would be paid back. The government on a local level, on a regional level, and a national level made it easy. They, for instance, in my state, and this is probably pretty widespread throughout Venezuela, the governor set up an insurance office in order to provide money for the collateral, so that somebody who was forming a cooperative, who had to put up a collateral, got backing from the government. But that defeats the whole idea of the collateral. The collateral was designed to avoid a situation in which people would just put the money in their pocket. So a lot of money was squandered in this program of cooperatives that was carried out between about 2003 and 2006. In 2006, the government established a system of community councils. The law of community councils was passed in, I think it was May of 2006, and the same kind of thing happened. But the community councils were a lot more, and have been a lot more successful than the cooperatives. But there is also a lot of squandering of money on that front also. Mechanisms or viable mechanisms have not been established in order to monitor these grants. And the logic behind it, and it makes sense, is that the more important cooperatives and the more important community councils are those involving the very poor, not even the working class, but the people who belong to the informal sector, the marginalized sector of the population, because these are people who don't have any organizational experience at all, not like union members who have organizational experience, they have a sense of discipline, they have a national leadership. The people who belong to the informal economy don't have that experience. So setting up a community council which receives money in order to carry out public works projects, there's a lot of talk about social programs in Latin America, and that, neoliberalism also carries out social programs, supports social programs. And after all, Bismarck in Germany in the 19th century was perhaps the founder of social programs, one of the first to carry out social programs. So, what's the relationship between the left and social programs? But these social programs involve empowerment. And I'm sure Bismarck didn't know what that word was. And the neoliberals don't know what that word is. When the government grants money to a community council that has designed a public works project and submitted that public works project to an assembly, they call it Asamblea de ciudadanos y ciudadanas, of men and women citizens. And those assemblies decide, vote on that project, and then that project is presented to the municipal government, which isn't usually the case, but the state government and the state oil company, the Ministry of Popular Participation. So they get funded. Now these are activities that poor people are carrying out that are novel experiences for them. So that the policy or the strategy has been not to be too strict, not to be too inflexible, in order to encourage these people. Because if you put up too many barriers, the people are going to get frustrated, they're going to drop out. So that makes sense. And it makes sense from a political viewpoint. Because from a political viewpoint, this is the social base of the Chavista movement, the poor people. The working class has become an important base, but at first it wasn't. After all, the Chavistas did not win the election. This was prior to the coup. They didn't win the elections for the Confederation. Then they set up their own confederation, and because of the coup attempt that the traditional labor leadership supported, the workers switched over from the right to the left, from the anti-Chavistas to the Chavistas. But the poor people, the marginalized sectors of the population, that's really the base, the social base of support. And so, in a sense, you can call this populism. Not forcing these poor people to put up collateral to ensure that this money is going to be well spent. And the political factor weighs in, because the government needs this support, and not only their votes, but also their mobilization. The mobilization capacity is extremely important. If the government loses that, if the Chavistas lose that mobilization capacity, that they, like during the Corimba last year, they called on their people to go on protests. And it wasn't because of that. Maduro would have been in hot water. The fact that he could show, okay, these people are protesting, but we have more mobilization capacity than they have. And it was true. This is what happened. So that what I'm saying is that the opposition, the tactics of the opposition, in a sense, is forcing the government, or at least convincing the government, to adopt certain pragmatic and populist policies that in the long run create problems. And the examples that I presented was this alliance, unofficial alliance, with the emerging bourgeoisie that led into the 2009 financial crisis. And the decision to be flexible, to not do much in the way of follow-ups of money that's allocated to these different social programs, that if that means that these programs, that some of them are going to fail, then that creates economic problems for the country, and it's wasted money. So, I believe that these failures have to be placed in a broader context. And so let me just make one last statement, and that is that each one of these decisions that I'm saying are made in order to face the enemy, but creates problems in the future, have ideological justifications. The justification for providing the poor people with this money for their social programs, and a lot of free goods, and a lot of highly subsidized goods, from electrical appliances to housing, and in some cases it's free for some people and very cheap for others, other poor people. Books are distributed for free, and other products that are free. The middle class Chavistas criticize this. The working class Chavistas probably criticize this also. But the poor people consider this only, something that's just. This is something that is compensating for the situation in which they don't have the purchasing power that wealthier people have. And the Chavista leaders who justify or defend these policies call it, and this is a slogan among the Chavistas, humanitarian socialism. Humanitarian socialism. This is an example. The poor people don't have money to buy books, we'll be given books. Another example, the government subsidized, the government expropriated a lot of companies that were producing products that were in short supply. And they accused these companies of price speculation, of creating shortages. So the government took over different coffee companies, oil, cooking oil companies, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they had, and as well as companies that were part of the infrastructure, basic industry, like telecommunications, steel, electricity, cement. Some of these companies had been privatized in the 1990s. Others, in the case of cement, were always private. This guy Mendoza that I mentioned before. But they had to pay for them. This is democratic socialism. If it was Cuba in the early 60s, it would have been a different story. But in the context of democratic socialism, it would have been contradicting for the government to say, well, we're going to confiscate these companies. And it would have created great political and economic problems at the international level. So, part of the problem with the reserves, the fact that the government doesn't have enough money to import the products, thus creating these scarcities and these long lines, have to do with the expropriations. So the expropriations were a response to the enemy. The enemy was withholding production. The enemy was involved in price speculation. But in the long run, they created other problems. So that's what I'm trying to place in context. So just in short, I think that this kind of analysis is important. Not everybody on the left likes it. I learned before I came here that somebody very high up in the Chavez government, I won't mention his name, but somebody very high up read my latest article that I published in New Left Project, very good online publication. It's called New Left Project. It comes out of England, and I had somebody send that article to this person who was high up in the Chavez government. He didn't like it at all. He said that it was overly critical. But I think that the criticism helps us place in context the mistakes. Okay, we identify the mistakes, but we also understand that some of these mistakes are the result of a situation in which you have an enemy that's part of this illegal opposition that I referred to, and an enemy that is willing to adopt any tactics or any strategy in order to overthrow the government. Thank you.
So thank you, sir. Questions, comments? Just introduce yourself and then.
Leslie Hudson with Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace. In your opinion, how big a role does the United States government play in this disruption and the protests and it seems we have our fingers in everybody's economic system and want to see anybody that's doing progressive work toppled.
Right. Okay, should I answer this or you want to? Okay, sure. Firstly, let me say that the U.S. government's statements against the Maduro government for violation of human rights and that kind of thing has a counterproductive effect for the U.S. government, for the opposition, in the sense that it helps unify the Chavez movement. I can say this on the basis of many observations that there's a lot of disillusionment with the Chavez movement, especially in the last couple of months. But with this recent resolution, Obama resolution, calling Venezuela a threat to U.S. national security, there isn't any Chavista who thinks that there's an element of truth. The accusation against he's the vice president of the party, of the Chavista party, but he's the president of the National Assembly, the Congress. His name is Diosdado Cabello, and he's being accused of heading a drug cartel called Solis, Cartel Solis. You read the Wall Street Journal article that has been circulating a lot about him. And it is, I won't go into the details, but it's just so bogus. But in addition to being bogus, there's the one statement that anybody who's critical would read the article and say, there's no evidence. They're quoting, or they're referring to drug traffickers who are accusing Diosdado Cabello of being the head of this cartel. But really what they want is to get resident status in the United States. Who knows? But, I mean, they're not credible. So the one statement that seems credible is a leading, somebody who was an important Chavista, not one of the top leaders, but fairly important, who supported Chavez back in '92, became the governor of Aragua, which is a fairly important state. He became a minister. So they say that he went to the United States and he spilled the beans on Diosdado Cabello, and now the Chavistas are calling him corrupt. That's false. And if the Wall Street Journal had done any fact-checking, which is what they're supposed to do, fact-checking is something that's fundamental in journalism and the Wall Street Journal. But if they had done any fact-checking, they would have realized immediately that that statement was false. That he was accused of corruption while he was, corruption that took place allegedly while he was governor of Aragua. And with regard to public works projects and I don't know what else. He was accused of corruption, and he left the country, went to the United States, and started saying these things about Diosdado Cabello. So this unifies the Chavistas. On the other hand, it might stimulate or inspire the opposition. I don't know. I don't think so. I don't think it has that kind of effect. But there's no question that the United States has provided a lot of money for the opposition. The money that comes from the National Endowment for Democracy is public knowledge. They publish. But the amount of money that they spend on programs dwarfs what aid, U.S. aid, spends. And Ava Gollinger, her name is Ava Gollinger. She's a U.S., she says she's Venezuelan, she's U.S. Venezuelan, but she's a New Yorker. She's got a New Yorker accent, but she lived a long time in Venezuela. She lived some time in Venezuela. Her mother was Venezuelan. Now she's in the States again. And she has documented in several books and in a lot of her statements that you can get online, Ava Gollinger, that, one of the things she says is that the aid, I guess it was the aid that NED, National Endowment for Democracy, maybe it was U.S. aid, that Venezuela was a small recipient. The Venezuelan opposition, that money goes to different political and social groups. And Venezuela was a small recipient of that support. When Chavez came to power, it skyrocketed and it became number one with regard to U.S. support for democracy. So there's no question that the United States promoting democracy as well. And there's no question that the United States has provided substantial aid to the opposition.
Yes.
I'm curious, you talked a little bit about the cooperative sector. If you could maybe talk a little bit more about the strength of the cooperatives in the economy, maybe what their role is, and I guess as a short corollary, what is the strength of the factions that would like to see collectivization or further planning in the economy? Because you touched on it very briefly when you talked about state control over foreign imports, but I'm curious because it seems to me whenever I read about the problems of Venezuela that what's really happening is this class struggle, dual power situation developing to a certain extent, and the government is unwilling to or unable to take a step to break the backs of the bourgeoisie. So.
Yeah, the cooperative movement, Venezuela does not have a tradition of cooperatives. there's one section of Venezuela that does in a small kind of way, which is the city of Barquisimeto, the state of Lara. Barquisimeto is the capital of Lara. It is in Lara. So when Chavez created the cooperative movement, promoted it with substantial financial support, loans to the cooperatives, there was a proliferation of cooperatives throughout Venezuela, and they weren't particularly successful. Some of them are still around, but they weren't successful for the most part. But my feeling is that those that functioned for a period of a couple of years provided very important experience to people, because a lot of these cooperatives, like I said before, involve poor people. And so it's really unfair, or it's misleading to say, well, the cooperative meeting was a complete failure. Because, there are businesses here in the United States, the duration, the longevity of small businesses, I don't know what the statistic is, but a lot of them last a year or two. So that you have to see the statistics, which I don't have, of the number of cooperatives that had a duration of more than a couple of months. Because I would argue that those that lasted a year or more provided important experiences for those people. With regard to planning, the Chavez promoted the last year that he was alive the idea of aggregating the different community councils and forming communes, what are called communes in Venezuela. And that is a very uneven thing. Some of the communes, don't last long, others do. And the people that I interview who are involved in the program at the national level tell me, actually at different levels, state level, municipal, I've interviewed people at both state and national level. They tell me that when a community council has successfully carried out projects, public works projects, more than 3, then they get priority treatment. That is considered a reliable community council. And so you have community councils that have demonstrated in the course of time that they are fairly successful. But the communes, I think, assume, thinking in Spanish, assume that the community council program, that there are a massive number of community councils that are reliable. There are a large number of community councils. Officially, they talk of 30,000, or perhaps more. But I don't know how many have successfully completed 3 projects. So I think that's kind of jumping the gun. But that is the banner. That's one of the slogans of the Chavez movement. And Chavez said, "Communes or nothing." So that's a slogan: "Comunas or nada." And that's definitely the goal, is to strengthen these community councils and bring them together so that they can carry out projects that are more ambitious, that go beyond their community. The community councils consist of between 200 and 400 families. Mm-hmm. So you have larger communities, sectors of the city. In one case in Barcelona, where I live, a poor area, there were, I don't know if this is still the case, 34 community councils. So they set up a community for that area. It's this enclosed area, and they carry out projects that involve the whole community.
Like what?
Distribution of gas, in this case, and a project of producing bricks for construction.
Distribution of gas, like delivery of gas, like delivery of canister?
Right.
I mean? Okay.
Right.
So they're basically providing infrastructure in some sense.
Well, in this case, the distribution of gas, but in another case, actual production of bricks. In another case that I know, the success has been very limited in terms of real diversification of the economy, of production. With regard to diversification of the sale of oil, the country has been fairly successful, less dependent on the U.S. market than before. They sell 600,000 barrels a day to China. The goal is to increase it to 1 million within a couple of years of the date. And the program Petrocaribe sells oil with the possibility of a barter arrangement. I mentioned the case of Cuba. I think that Cuba pays for the oil, or part of the oil, with doctors. I don't know what percentage, with doctors. Now, those Caribbean markets used to be markets for U.S. oil companies. This is perhaps why, or one of the reasons why, WikiLeaks demonstrates, the cables demonstrate, that the United States had a campaign. In the case of Haiti, and I don't know how many other countries, but I know in the case of Haiti, the U.S. diplomats spoke to the president of Haiti, realized that there wasn't any argument with regard to what was good for Haiti. And so, I mean, this is what they're saying in the cables. That, well, we realized that the only argument we could provide the president of Haiti is that the United States doesn't want Petrocaribe to be successful. They couldn't think of any argument with regard to what's good for Haiti. And this took place in a number of countries. So obviously there's a campaign against Petrocaribe. Petrocaribe involves, I think, more than 15, maybe 17, 18 countries of the Caribbean nations and Central America, in which the country pays 60% now, I believe 60% upfront, and the rest they're given very lenient credit terms to pay over a substantial period of time, like 22 or 23 years. So this is diversification, there's no question about it. But with regard to the economy, you know, Chavez's discourse didn't emphasize at all production up until 2007. The discourse was based on social programs, social problems, but after he was re-elected president in 2006, in 2007, in December 2006, in 2007 and 2008, he nationalized the electricity companies, the telephone company, Cement, as I mentioned before, and a number of other companies, the steel company. And he started emphasizing production. And he started emphasizing the working class. Up until then, his discourse was more geared towards the marginalized sectors of the population. So since 2007, there's been some emphasis in terms of the programs, in terms of the discourse, but they haven't been particularly successful. And unfortunately, the companies that were expropriated have not been successful. The opposition says it's a complete flop. That's false, because the telephone company is well run. The banks that were taken over and amalgamated into one or two major banks. I have an account in one of them. And those banks are decent. They're well run. I mean, you can't say that there are any specific problems, or the service is worse than the private banks. So, and the electricity companies, even though they're all blackouts, but so they're not all a flop. That's what the opposition says. But in the case of steel, production has plummeted. Production before the takeover, or I don't know whether it was prior to Chavez, I can't remember, or prior to the nationalization. Prior to the nationalization, prior to 2008, it was nationalized in 2008, was 4 million liquid tons. And now it's less than half of that. So there are some labor problems. And the problems involve poor administration and disputes between the labor movement that calls for worker control and management that doesn't really accept it in practice. But there's another factor also, which the opposition doesn't mention when they talk about these failures, and that is that with prices that are so artificially low, like for cement and steel and other things, the companies are producing at a loss.
Right.
And so the system of administered prices has a lot to do with that. But just to sum up, everybody realizes that the dependence on oil is a bad thing. And the government hasn't been particularly successful in promoting diversification. They've attempted their participation in Mercosur is designed to reorient the market towards the south of Latin America instead of the United States, which is still the leading partner, commercial partner of the United States. So they made attempts, but up until now, the success has been quite limited.
Please go ahead. Yep.
Me? Okay.
Hi.
Hi, how you doing?
Good.
Good discussion. I want to ask a bigger question. And I heard you last night at Union College, and you talked some about socialism in Venezuela. That's what I want to ask you about, but I don't want to ask you, is Venezuela socialist? I want to preface it this way. In the Marxist and the Leninist tradition, socialism is a period of struggle and transition and construction of communism. And in fact, Lenin himself talked in the Soviet Union of the process of transition to socialism. So in that frame, could you give us an evaluation of where the struggle towards socialism stands in Venezuela today, both in terms of the society and in terms of the government?
Yeah, I believe that socialism is a stage that is inherently conflictive. That the idea of consolidation, that you can somehow reach a moment in which there's a certain amount of stability, both social, political, and economic, all those three things, it is really not what socialism, unfortunately, is about. That if socialism is going to, move in the direction of something better, and eventually, say, communism, or eventually something that, what you call it what you like, but if it's going to eventually achieve stability and some kind of consensus, wide consensus in the country, free of the kind of conflict that you have now, that's going to take time. So there's going to be an extended period of time of conflict. I'm not saying that myself. There are a number of people who write specifically on Venezuela who state that we're realizing that socialism is inherently conflictive, and that the class struggle, when I was a kid and learning about Marxism, they tell you that socialism, you continue to have a certain amount of conflict because you don't have complete equality. Why? Because the people in the city make more than the people in the country. Maybe you have a situation, they said that in those days, in which men make more than women. You might have all kinds of inequalities like that. But I think that socialism has proved to be worse than that, much more difficult, much more conflictive than that. Because it's just a question of city as opposed to countryside. That's something that might be manageable and free of conflict. But see, what they don't say, what that version didn't say, a kind of dogmatic Marxism or simplistic Marxism, is that you have class conflict because, not because of difference of location where you live, you have class conflict because there are different visions and different ideologies, say, and different interests that sometimes conflict. In the case of Venezuela, just to give you an example, one of many, these community councils that I mentioned before are told that the money that they get for public works projects, they should carry out those projects themselves. They should not hire a company or pay a company give them a contract in order to carry out the project, they should do it themselves. And they should do it themselves because if a company gets the contract, then the workers are going to form a union. And the construction workers union is a lot of organized crime controls the construction workers, some of the union. So if you talk to members of the marginalized sectors of the population who belong to the community council, and they tell you that, you know, the unions are corrupt. What they do is they force you to hire their people, and then those people don't do anything, in the best of cases. But they come armed, and this is true. They come armed, they threaten people and everything else. I mean, these are real mafioso type organizations. If you talk to the Chavista trade union leaders, they're very insistent that unions are necessary because this is work, this is a workplace. And their unions are not mafiosos. I mean, they're the construction workers unions that are the Chavistas, and they'll even say, some of them will say, even the unions that belong to the opposition. You know, you got to make a distinction between unions that are not involved in organized crime and aren't going to use violence in order to pressure people, and the mafioso unions. So that's an example of a conflict between the working class and the marginalized sectors of the population. It's just one example to show that the kind of class conflict that takes place under socialism is much more profound and much more difficult to resolve than the type of conflict that, you know, was talked about back in the 60s or the 50s when I was growing up, 60s, early 60s. Socialism was defined as a transitional society, but really, basically, free of acute conflict. I think we're seeing that socialism is based on very intense conflict. And that's not to mention what I referred to before about the private sector. I mean, those conflicts are even deeper because it involves the bourgeoisie and people who are committed to socialism. But as the Venezuelan case showed, when Chavez decided to provide preferential treatment to the emerging bourgeoisie, some kind of alliance is necessary. That's controversial. Some of the leftist analysts criticize that. Claudio Katz, in Spanish, is an Argentine economist, very good. He's got a very good article in the latest issue of Latin American Perspectives, a leftist academic publication. I've got a response to his article. I don't criticize it, I just comment on it. But Katz, well, some of the leftist critics will say that alliance is a recipe for problems, that the government shouldn't ally itself with the business sector at all. So that's a matter of controversy. But in any case, these kinds of problems, these kinds of situations demonstrate that socialism is a rough path. And the idea of consolidation and the idea of a stage, that socialism could be a stage. And so there'll be a period of stability, and then things will lead into another kind of conflict, another kind of transition, and then maybe we'll get communism. It's not going to work out that way.
Let's take one last question, and then we can have informal conversations with Steve. Joe.
Yeah, I guess my question is similar to Andor's question, which is a little bit bigger. And it seems like it's important for revolutionaries and radicals to look at what's going on in Venezuela, because it's an example where there's still capitalism in the country, and yet there's not a capitalist government. There's a government that does support the poor sectors, it does support the working class. And that creates a kind of unstable situation. And the longer that situation lasts, the more international capital, like the United States, can undercut it and cause it to go backwards. And we're seeing some of that. In some of the things you've said here today, we're seeing, less support and so forth. And so that if you can't move fairly expeditiously, sometimes you can't, and sometimes you don't want to, But if you can't move expeditiously in the direction of socialism, of nationalizing the industry and as well as a monopoly over foreign trade and things like that, in the way that Cuba did, you run the risk of going back. And we've seen so many examples of this throughout history in many, many countries where there was revolutions that then turned back because they didn't move expeditiously. So when you talk about mobilizing people, like the poor sectors and the working class, if they counter-mobilized against the demonstrators that took place, mobilization to me does not just mean calling people out on a demonstration. It means organizing like committees for defense of the revolution. It might mean arming people to defend the revolution. It might mean, instead of the government taking over those trucks that are going to Colombia, that you have people organized that do this, that understand and see the whole process all the way through. So people understand that they have to nationalize these industries because they are hurting the economy, not because it's some ideological thing that's good to do. And do you see that process in Venezuela?
Yeah, it's a good question.
In fact, I was struck by the similarities of what you were saying in Venezuela and what led up to the overthrow of Allende in Chile.
Yeah.
Very similar process.
Yeah. It's a very good question. And I argued that there's certain moments that that deepening of the process is more feasible than other moments, and that it's not an option for revolutionaries in power to do it or not do it. I mean, they've got to do it. If they don't do it, if there are missed opportunities, then they're going to pay the consequences. So it's not something, well, it's a good thing to do, but we've got, we can think about this and maybe not do it. It's essential. It's essential. There are other moments, and I agree that the concept of, what Trotsky called the permanent revolution, I think there's an element of truth in that. It's got to be ongoing. But I do believe that in certain situations, the government is on the defensive. It's on the defensive right now. And so I'm sympathetic to Maduro in the sense that, I do think he's got to act. I criticize him for not acting. But on the other hand, I realize that he can't, at this particular moment, really deepen the process in a major way. With regard, but, what you said about, we've seen so many cases in which there's a lot of enthusiasm, there's a process of change, and then all of a sudden, there's a rollback. And that's true. When there's an economic crisis, the people in power very often make big compromises and just abandon any hope of meaningful change. But in the case of Maduro, one of the things I have to give him credit for is that in this very difficult situation, and with the oil prices having plummeted, a non-leftist government would become neoliberal, would embrace neoliberalism. And that's what happened in Venezuela with Carlos Andrés Pérez. He wasn't a leftist, but he was a social democrat. And he nationalized the oil, he nationalized the iron industry, he practically nationalized aluminum, and he passed important social legislation in the 70s during his first government. He comes to power, he's elected in 1988, he comes to power and he announces the great turnabout, what he calls El Gran Viraje. And that was a change of 180 degrees. He implemented neoliberalism, and there were riots, disturbances, the Caracazo, which took place just weeks after that. So Maduro has made very clear that he's not going to do that. That he increases the minimum wage, which is important for old people because pensions now under Chavez have been pegged to the minimum wage. He announced, but some of the things that he announces in the name of not being a neoliberal, I don't think makes sense. For instance, he's kept the price of gasoline so cheap it's practically free in Venezuela. And he says he's going to increase it, but he doesn't. He says he's going to wait for the right moment. But like a year and a half has gone by, and he hasn't done anything. So I think there are certain things that he can do that he's not doing because he doesn't want to be a neoliberal, but he should do it. Because it's not going to mean great sacrifice, and it's not going to set off demonstrations and protests against him. If he increases the price of gasoline, nobody's going to say anything. If he increases the price of preferential dollars for tourists, middle-class tourists who travel, they're getting these preferential dollars very limited, just $700 in the case of traveling to the United States, a little bit more for other countries. But if he were to increase what you have to pay for those preferential dollars, if he were to increase it 4 or 5-fold, nobody would protest. So I criticize him for not acting, but you got to give him credit for rejecting neoliberal formulas at this critical moment. And just to end with what you said about the community and popular participation, there are militias. Chavez created militias, and they work out there. They do exercises. They're organized throughout Venezuela. And I mean, I have contact with people who are involved in the militias. They are well organized, involving a certain number of people, and the community participation. There is community participation in the struggle against, or the activity in opposition to the hoarding. It's the community councils very often that discover these deposits and go to Sunday. Sunday is the consumer protection agency that's involved in occupying places that are accused of hoarding as well as price speculation. So there is a certain amount of community participation in that.
Thank you. Thank you very much.